what does this airplane, and this airplane all have in common? Well, we have a very special episode of Celebrating Aviation with Mike Machat, where we'll tell you the answer. But before that, take a look at these names. These are very significant because these names belong to these gentlemen. And these gentlemen began companies on the East Coast of the United States. So the answer to that question is these three airplanes were all built in the Northeastern US. And we're going to look in this episode at America's East Coast aerospace heritage. Now, I mentioned East Coast because we've done a video on the West Coast companies. I have a link in the title block. And the big difference is the West Coast companies were giant operations that built every possible type of aircraft, helicopter, missile, transport, jet, airliner, you name it. These companies built it. And by comparison, the East Coast companies were much smaller and much more specialized. They would build just a certain type of airplane or only for one service. Well, let's begin in upstate New York with the Curtiss Airplane Company. And this is very significant because Glenn Curtiss was a competitor to the Wright brothers in the early 1900s. They had a bit of a tussle over patents, and we'll see how that worked out in a moment. But Curtiss was up in Hammondsport, New York, and then later opened a plant in Buffalo. But Glenn Curtiss is considered the father of naval aviation because it was a Curtiss pusher that was flown from and onto a converted battle cruiser, which was really the beginning of naval carrier operations when you think about it. And all this was just, 7 and 8 years after the Wright brothers' first flight, just incredible amount of progress. In 1919, a Curtiss seaplane called the NC-4 made the first transatlantic flight with a few stops, but reached from mainland US to Europe across the Atlantic, and that was a pretty significant operation. In 1925, Curtiss Racer won the Schneider Trophy race, piloted by Jimmy Doolittle, seen here. And we're going to go to Roosevelt Field, Long Island, where in the Hempstead Plains, a large flat area in central Nassau County, became the cradle of aviation. And that's, of course, the name of the museum that is currently at the former Mitchell Field today. But Roosevelt Field was the launching point for Charles Lindbergh's famous New York to Paris nonstop flight in 1927. And in the foreground of the photo, you see the Curtiss plant. Now, this is interesting. This is the world's first ever research and development facility for aviation. It was called the Experimental Factory, and it was located adjacent to Roosevelt Field. The solution to the legal issues with Curtiss and Wright was to merge the two companies. And in 1929, the Curtiss-Wright Corporation was formed. The name Curtiss went to the aircraft, the name Wright went to the engines. But during World War II, in just a 5-year period, this company built nearly 30,000 airplanes, 143,000 engines, 146,000 propellers, and had 180,000 employees. It was the second largest defense contractor in the United States. The Buffalo plant produced the P-40 Warhawk and the C-46 Commando. And I have some photos, courtesy of viewer David Krigbaum, who took some shots at the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force Museum in Japan. And this is a C-46 in JASDAF markings. It's an immense airplane, quite a bit larger than the C-47 or the Douglas DC-3. And I remember seeing these flying up and down the countryside when I was stationed in Japan in the late 60s. So it had tremendous longevity, quite a great airplane. An interesting footnote is the progress seen here in just 40 years in aviation, going from a 50-mile-an-hour biplane to a 500-mile-an-hour jet. And the XP-87 is the very last of the Curtiss airplanes. Well, we're going to head over to Niagara Falls area and visit the Bell plant. Bell is synonymous with helicopters, but believe it or not, they started with an airplane. They had the Airacuda. This is the P-39 Airacobra, P-63 King Cobra, and a very significant machine, the XP-59 Aerocomet, which was America's first jet-powered aircraft in 1942. The helicopter operations began at the plant up there in New York in 1947. They had a series of models from the helicopter division and arriving at the Model 47, which became the first helicopter to be commercially certified for operation in the United States. Here we see a Bell 47D. The G model was actually built in the Fort Worth, Texas plant that Bell operates to this day. Most significant were the X-planes that were produced in upstate New York. The X1 first through the sound barrier, X1A to Mach 2.4, the X2 first to Mach 3, and the Bell X5 first variable geometry sweeping wing aircraft based on German technology from World War II. Company wound up as Bell Textron in 1960. And now we're going to take a short bus ride down to Elmira and visit the Schweitzer Company. Elmira is considered the cradle of soaring in America. Schweitzer built a number of very significant sailplanes and gliders. Here we see a 123 flown by Paul Bickle to the world altitude record of 46,000 feet in 1961. This is a 233, and I should mention the numerology here. The first digit is the number of seats. So this would be a 233. That's the model numbers, the last two numbers. The 126 still being flown today in its own sport class, great little sailplane. And when soaring peaked in the 80s for that type of glider, Schweitzer converted to building the Hughes 300 helicopter under license and became the Schweitzer 300. They also took over the Grumman AgCat construction and built a series of unusual looking motor gliders. Here we see the RU-38 Twin Condor, but there were a series of these airplanes built for government agencies for special operations. Well, let's hop on a Mohawk flight and head over to Hartford, Connecticut. We're going to visit the Pratt & Whitney plant, and Pratt & Whitney was there building piston engines and jet engines to this day. And then we'll take a short ride down to the coast of Long Island Sound at Stratford, Connecticut, and see the Vought operation. This is the first Corsair. It was a biplane. Vought was part of United Aircraft Corporation along with Sikorsky, and there was actually a union between the two companies we'll see in a moment. But the Corsair that we're more familiar with began as the XF4U-1, seen there. And the Kingfisher was a scout airplane, a catapult launched off of battle cruisers. But here we see the F4U-1 Corsair. Sorry for the typo there. It's F, no hyphen. But you can see Long Island Sound in the background. And they produced quite a few of the Corsairs, which were the mainstay of the Navy World War II Pacific Air Arm. Company became Ling Temco Vought in 1960. The jet operations went to Dallas, Texas. And today it is part of Northrop Grumman. As mentioned, Sikorsky was a partner, and their name is synonymous with helicopters also, but they began with aircraft, flying boats, to be specific. The S-38, the S-40 and S-42 used by Pan Am in the Caribbean and in the Pacific, respectively. And Igor Sikorsky was a Russian-born emigre to the US and was a huge proponent of single-rotor helicopters. He built the VS for Vought Sikorsky 300, which he's seen flying here. And the single rotor with the tail rotor configuration was the mainstay of Sikorsky helicopters to this day. They built a series of copters for the military, passenger helicopters, piston and jet. And the CH-53 series still in production, and that is the largest single rotor helicopter being built in the United States. They were part of United Technologies, as mentioned, and today they are part of Lockheed Martin. Well, we'll take a trip down to Philadelphia in Pennsylvania and visit the Piasecki plant. Here's Frank Piasecki, and his big dream was twin rotor helicopters. He's seen waving from the window of this machine, the HRP, called the, for obvious reasons, Flying Banana. This is conducting a rescue demonstration at Lakehurst, New Jersey Naval Air Station. But the twin rotor concept turned into a very successful series of aircraft. And Piasecki emerged into the Vertol Corporation. See the H-21 here at Edwards Air Force Base, great rescue helicopter. And the V-44 was the city version of the H-21, and Vertol in the early 60s became Boeing Vertol, producing the 107 in passenger form, the C-46 in military form, and the C-47 Chinook, which first flew in the early 60s and is still in production today. And it's now part of Boeing helicopter. We'll swing over to Lock Haven, Pennsylvania at the northern end of the Appalachians, beautiful countryside up there. And we'll visit the Piper factory. William T. Piper began, his claim to fame was the J-3 Cub before World War II. And then a series of family-oriented airplanes, the Super Cruiser, the Pacer, the Tri-Pacer, the Super Cub, 180 and 150 horse version of the original J-3. The Comanche series and the Apache and Aztec series, all built in Pennsylvania. The Cherokee design is out of Vero Beach, Florida. But Piper Aircraft Company built 300,000 plus airplanes total, and 90,000 of those are still flying today. Unbelievable. Well, let's hop aboard an Allegheny Convair 580 and fly up to my old stomping ground, as we used to call it back there, Long Island. I lost my accent in the Air Force, but hey, you can see my house from here. There it is, Rockville Center. That was my hometown. You can see the proximity to Idlewild and now JFK Airport at the extreme right edge of the photo. But Long Island had a tremendous amount of aviation starting from World War II and up into the 70s, actually. We had Edo, Sperry, Grumman, Gyrodyne, and Republic. And I should mention that Edo is the initials of the founder, Earl D. Osborne. Well, let's take a drive out to Farmingdale. That's about 45 miles east of Manhattan. And this is the Fairchild Flying Field as it looked in 1929. An outfit called Grumman used that factory also for a few years before they moved to their own location in Bethpage, about 8 miles to the west. And a gentleman named Seversky started his company in 1934. Seversky built small, stout, but fast, rugged racing airplanes. Their motto was "Sever the Sky." Alexander de Seversky was a Russian count and a World War I ace, tremendous aviator, and a huge proponent of military aviation. Here we see him flying the SEV prototype up at upper left with his chief designer, Alexander Kartvelli, in the rear seat. And at lower right is the first Seversky Racer, piloted by Jackie Cochran, who won the Bendix Trophy in this airplane. The BT-8 was their first production contract for the military, and it was the Army's first all-metal enclosed cockpit trainer. And here we have Seversky's last airplane, the XP-41, which bears an interesting resemblance to another World War II legendary machine, which we'll see in a moment. But Seversky was voted out by the board due to some political issues and other problems, and the company became Republic Aviation in 1939. And their first two airplanes were the P-43 Lancer and the XP-47 Thunderbolt prototype. But you can see the family resemblance. So here's a Fairchild Flying Field in 1929, and just a short decade later, it emerged into the Republic factory, which produced all the P-47s in World War II. They had an annex in Evansville, Indiana, but the main plant was here in Farmingdale. I've done a separate video on Republic, which goes into a lot more detail, and again, a link in the title block. But for right now, let's look at the production lines. We had the P-47. This is looking east in Building 17, the final assembly facility. Looking in the other direction, in the after the war, we had the Republic Seabee. The Republic Rainbow XR-12 was in the background, and the F-84 Thunderjet is over on the right side. It was a pivotal and wrenching time for the company trying to find its way in the post-World War II era. But the F-84 Thunderjet straight wing airplane was one of the mainstays of the Korean War Air Force. And the F-84F Thunderstreak swept wing, and the F-105 Thunder Chief. This is all the same building, in the same production line, in the same facility all those years. Well, During the Vietnam War, the 105 production ended, and the company was taken over by Fairchild, became Fairchild Republic in 1965. But there are a number of significant machines that emerged from this operation. First being the Fairchild Republic Experimental Safety Vehicle. And you're saying, what is a car doing in this video? Well, the ESV was created using aerospace technology and all the pilot survival methods for seatbelts and crash resistance, collapsible structure. And there were 132 innovations from this machine that are legislated into automotive production and are part of every car on the road today. It all started with this. In 1972, the A-10 came to be. In 1985, the T-46, and this was kind of the swan song for Fairchild Republic. By 1987, October of 87, the company ceased operation, and that was it. But we'll take a short drive over to Grumman in Bethpage, and also out at Calverton at the eastern end of the island. And Grumman built aircraft for the Navy. You can see all the different versions here. And of course, there was the Hellcat, the Wildcat. But by the jet age, they were producing the first jets used on carriers. The XF-10 Jaguar was a variable sweep airplane, kind of a predecessor to the F-14. Tiger was their first supersonic jet. The Grumman airplanes were used by the Blue Angels up until the F-4 Phantom. They built a number of very significant flying boats, the smaller Goose and Widgeon, and then here we see the Mallard and the Albatross. And the propeller airplanes, both piston and turboprop, really put Grumman on the map. The Gulfstream, of course, was the great grandfather to the G4s and 5s and 650s that are flying today. The jet age, of course, the A6 Intruder, the turboprop Mohawk, and the king of the fleet, the thoroughbred, the F-14 Tomcat. Fabulous, fabulous airplane. Now, if you're going to the moon and returning a man safely to Earth by the end of the 1960s, you're going to need this. This is a lunar excursion model referred to as the LEM. This was built in Bethpage. And I have to give a shout out to the Cradle of Aviation Museum. My dear friend Josh Stoff, who's the curator there, does a fantastic job. They have not only one, they have two LEMs on display. One is in a mock white room. And this is really a joy because there are retired Grumman employees who actually worked on this, who are there giving tours. You can see what the LEM looked like under construction. And then they have a diorama full size of the lunar scape and a LEM from one of the Apollo missions that was canceled. And it is an amazingly large machine. And you see an astronaut coming down the ladder, but it's an impressive exhibit. And I wanted to take a moment to just mention that. Cradle of Aviation Museum at Mitchell Field in Garden City, Long Island. Grumman is now part of Northrop Grumman. And let's hop on a Piedmont FH-227 and head down to Hagerstown, Maryland, where this airplane was actually built. We're going to look at Fairchild. Now, this airplane doesn't have any engines. What's going on? It's the Chase XCG-20 glider, cargo carrying glider that was towed by C-47s. And well, it was the beginning. It became the Strukoff Avitruck with engines. Strukoff was the name of the designer, Michael Strukoff. But Fairchild had a series of cargo airplanes, the C-82, 119, the XC-120 pack plane, which was a concept for a detachable cargo pod. But that little Chase glider emerged into the C-123 provider. Fairchild built the F-27 under license from Fokker. The Hiller Hornet and Hiller H-12 became part of the Fairchild operation with Fairchild Hiller. And here we see the 227 taking off from Hagerstown. So I mentioned the large West Coast companies and the fact that they built all these different kinds of airplanes. And here, as we saw, the East Coast companies did not, with one exception. And that was the Martin Company in Baltimore, right near Annapolis on the coast of the Chesapeake Bay. Martin started with bombers. Here's the MB-2, quite a mammoth airplane for its era. The B-10, of course, the famed B-26 in World War II. The XB-51, did you know it was named the Panther? I didn't know that. And that never went into production, but it was replaced by the B-57, an English design built by Martin. Of course, we had the flying boats, the Martin M130 China Clipper. There were 3 of them. Sadly, none survived to this day. But a number of very significant military flying boats. And here we see the Mars, the Mariner, the Marlin, and the ultimate jet-powered Seamaster, a transonic seaplane. Amazing. The Mercator and the Mauler. You notice that all the names of the Martin airplanes begin with the letter M. Oh, that Mohawk flight that we took, that was a Martin 404. We had the Matador missile, which was originally referred to as the B-61. The Mace, part of the Cold War arsenal. These were actually stationed in Europe. And the Titan II ICBM, which gained fame as the launch vehicle for the Gemini capsules. The company is today part of Martin, or I'm sorry, it became Martin Marietta and is today part of Lockheed Martin. And again, just a snapshot in progress, 20 years between these 2 airplanes, just really unbelievable, the rate of progress in aviation at that time, and reflections of a great, great company. Well, I'm going to close with these 2 gentlemen. We see Alexander Disiversky on the left. On the right is Scott Crossfield, 2 aviation pioneers from 2 different eras in aviation. And I bring this up because they came together at a tour at Edwards Air Force Base where Seversky actually got to sit in the X-15. That's Crossfield at upper left smiling. And I get the chills just looking at this photo because Seversky's sitting in an airplane. Think of this. This man designed and flew 300-mile-an-hour racing planes. And in his lifetime, he gets to sit in an airplane that flew 3,000 miles an hour without breaking a sweat. So what became of Seversky's company, Republic? As I said, it went under in 1987, and the plant was eventually torn down. And one of my least favorite words in aerospace, it was repurposed as a shopping center. But here we see a photo taken adjacent to runway 19 at Republic Field. This photo was taken in 1961. You want to see what it looks like today? That's taken from about the same spot. And we're seeing the back side of the Republic Field shopping center. And all those names that we saw in the beginning of the episode, well, there's only 4 left today in use. And as far as the East Coast companies, believe it or not, there's only 1. And that would be Sikorsky, building helicopters in Stratford, Connecticut. And of course, we should mention Pratt & Whitney, still building engines in Hartford, Connecticut. So there you have it, the story of the East Coast manufacturers in the United States and their contribution to aviation history. As always, special thanks to the great folks who helped make this possible. My friend Joshua Stoff at the Cradle of Aviation Museum, photographer Tony Landis, and the Wings and Air Power Historical Archive. Thank you so much for celebrating aviation with Mike Machat. I hope you enjoyed this episode. We're always happy to bring aviation history to you. If you haven't subscribed, we'd love to have you on board. And please hit the like button on your way out. It does help us with YouTube and their logarithms. So again, thanks for watching. And until next time, take care.